All right, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Celeste Richie. I'm with Results for America, and we appreciate you joining for our webinar, talking with some folks from Pennsylvania, from the Workforce Development Board, about their journey in using evidence definitions to push for better outcomes for residents. And really excited to have this panel today. I want to start just by acknowledging the collective and long-held grief and rage that is being felt in our communities and has been felt in our communities, not only over the recent murders of Black community members, but also the historic and ongoing police violence, oppressive systems built on white supremacy culture, and the disproportionate impacts of COVID on Black and Brown communities. We're going to talk more about this with our panelists in a few moments, but I wanted to take a moment to pause and just acknowledge the context that we're in, to provide space for any participants today who may still be processing their grief and may not be up to participating, and just kind of take a moment to, not pretend that we are where we are. So just wanted to say that, take a moment. So, before we turn to our panelists, before I introduce them, I just appreciate everyone joining us. Share a little bit on the next slide here about Results for America. For those of you who aren't familiar, we're a nonprofit, and our mission is to make investing in what works the new normal, so that governments can use and decision makers can use effective evidence and data to increase the impact of the more than $1 trillion of government spending that happens every year to improve the lives of young people, of families, and communities. And part of our work is in the workforce system, which is where we'll be focusing today. This next slide, you can see a map of where we work across the country. And as you can see, we're in a lot of places, and hoping to expand the number of places that we're in as well. Turning now to the next slide, I just wanted to take a minute to introduce our panelists. They all have, amazing bios that I could read for you, but I wanted to actually just save time for the conversation today. And so I want to go ahead and just do a quick introduction and invite you all to look these folks up, because they have a lot of impressive work and important work that they've been up to, but we'll go ahead and just do a quick introduction here. So first we have Allison Jones, who's the Deputy Secretary for Policy and Planning in Governor Wolf's office. Next we have James Martini, who's the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Workforce Development Board, and both Allison and James are part of RFA's Workforce Fellowship, which is kind of how we all got to be here today. And they were so kind as to introduce me to Chekemma Fullmore-Townsend, who's the chair of the Youth Committee for the Pennsylvania Workforce Development Board, and also the CEO of Philadelphia Youth Network. And so I've had the pleasure of also working with Chekemma as we've been kind of going through this journey around evidence in workforce. If we could go to the next slide, please. So just really briefly kind of how we got here. As I mentioned, Allison and James joined the RFA State and Local Workforce Fellowship back in October of 2019. And that involved, creating a shared learning agenda and some strategies and plans for how to implement more evidence-based practices. In March and April of this year, the Workforce Development Board, the Youth Committee, actually started to discuss and then approved the evidence definitions that we'll introduce to you all in a little bit. In April, the Continuous Improvement Committee also discussed and then approved the evidence definitions. And then in May, the full State Workforce Development Board unanimously approved the evidence definitions. So what are these evidence definitions? If we could go to the next slide, please. So we're happy to we'll share these materials with everyone, including the slides, and we can share the full text of the evidence definitions. But I wanted to show a table which just kind of demonstrates kind of the continuum of evidence definitions. I want to call out that there's lots of kinds of evidence, and what we're focusing here is really the continuum that gets to causal evidence, rigorous causal evidence. You can see all the way on the right-hand side, strong as a category and what is required under that in terms of the kind of evaluation methodology, what the results should be showing, the number of evaluations, and then whether that evaluation was internal or external. But we do encourage and support all types of evaluation and recognize that not every program or organization is going to be ready for, a full-scale randomized controlled trial. And there's lots of ways that we can start to build different types of evidence as programs and organizations move along this continuum. So this slide is kind of the most text heavy, so we can leave it up for just a moment, but maybe shift over so that we can see our panelists a little bit more clearly. And as I acknowledged at the top of the webinar, our conversation today cannot happen in isolation, and our work doesn't happen separately from the context of centuries of white supremacy culture. So given that each of us is dedicated in different ways to improving a system, the workforce system, that was also built to systematically exclude certain people, and specifically for Black folks, I'm hoping that each of the panelists could actually share your thoughts and feelings not only about this moment in time, but how we can center racial justice in our work, and then how you see specifically Pennsylvania's recent adoption of evidence definitions as connected to racial justice. And I'd love to give the floor first to Chekemma.
Well, thank you, Celeste, and thank you again for having me, and also for having the courage to, abandon your traditional plans and make space for this very important both discussion, but also moment in time that we have as Americans and as citizens and as people who value human life to just connect and be on one accord around both the devastation, but also the hope that solutions can bring to this time. And so I just wanted to acknowledge your courage and thank you for being forward thinking in your leadership. It's very difficult to have a conversation about evidence or even performance or policy design or performance and not have a frank conversation about the realities of what we see in the data, about the consistent exclusion of those who are most affected from the decision-making process, right? And disenfranchisement and sort of decades of policies that sort of promote racial disparity in access to opportunity, and most importantly, access to the American dream. At the same time, we're in a moment where we can make better choices, right? Information is more readily available. We have more opportunities to interrupt systems of oppression and weaken those systems by doing better work. And so I come to this conversation, I come to the work as the chair of the youth committee with decades of experience working with young people who particularly experience these policies in oftentimes traumatic ways, and are looking and seeking and relying on programs and services, especially those funded by the workforce system, to help them both build stronger skills to attach to the workforce, because it's seen as a concrete step out of poverty. It's seen as a concrete step that you can take. And so when I look at the unrest around the country, when I look at the protests, both peaceful and violence, when I think about the immediate response, I think those agitations and those sort of reflections are important reminders to arrest us, to stop us from the norm, to force us to think differently. But I'm also equally invested in the development of solutions that will be long lasting and change that goes beyond the immediate. And I think that this conversation that we're having today is not just about evidence, but also about change and about shifting policy, practice, mindsets, in relation to how we invest money, how we evaluate what's working, and how we make space for a continuum of realities related to implementation. And what I appreciate most about this discussion is that it's a framework that allows for space and development and growth. And I think in the past, we've had conversations about evidence-based programming being very absolute, resolute, and driving investments in that direction. And that was almost to the exclusion of programs that maybe are doing effective work in the context of implementation needed for their communities. And so I'm excited about our conversation to talk about that journey. And one of the reasons why I was, very invested in this is because we need to change the conversation about how we don't need to necessarily weaponize information and performance, right, over communities. And I think this is one way that we can actually use information and a framework to grow the capacity of programs and acknowledge multiple types of expertise, evidence, in youth development, we say lived experience, right? To validate the experiences of young people as co-creators of policy and contributors. We talk about their lived experience. And I think this widening of the way we conceive evidence does that for policy and does that for practice. So that's my observations of this moment and the way that this conversation connects to it.
Thanks so much, Chekemma. Appreciate that perspective. And yeah, I appreciate that invitation to thinking about evidence in a way that makes room for everyone. Allison, do you want to go next and share some thoughts on the same topic?
Well, just to kind of bring this experience to kind of policy and practice at the state level, our WIOA combined state plan that we submitted to the Department of Labor, which we haven't heard back on, but it really emphasized, and this was an important part of our plan for the State Workforce Board and the Governor's Office and our administration, that plan prioritized equity and diversity and inclusion in our workforce development system. But I think what the last few weeks have done is remind us that we can't just make that a general priority. We have to live those values in the programs and services that we provide. And I think there's an opportunity for the Commonwealth to take that to a new level and recommit to reviewing our policies and our programs and our initiatives with a racial and ethnic lens to make sure that we're really looking deep into our systems. So much of what we're talking about is systemic discrimination. And so as much work as we do as individuals or setting this as a policy priority of the state, we need to look into our systems and make sure that they're serving our customers equitably. So I think that is definitely an area where we're going to be heading as a Commonwealth in workforce development and in other areas.
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, I also love that that comment that you made about kind of, the level of analysis that we need to have happen within the systems and the programs, because I think that as policies have evolved over time, when they were initially started, a lot of times the racial discrimination was very obvious. No one was trying to hide it. And then we moved through sort of era of like color blindness and other things, but the impact of those policies remained the same, even though we're not calling it what it really is. And so taking that time to step back and see what we really need to do to change those policies that have been in place that have those disproportionate impacts. So thank you for sharing that. James, I'll turn to you now.
Sure. I think both Allison and Chekemma did a really nice job of framing that. So I'll just piggyback a couple thoughts onto what was already said. I think one of the big reasons we wanted to get involved in the fellowship program with RFA is because we knew we didn't have the type of evidence to properly assess what we were doing. Speaking for myself, I think the further along we go, I think it becomes abundantly more clear that I didn't have a full understanding of how lacking we were in that evidence. I think we traditionally relied on the federal measures that they give us. And if you look at those, everybody's grouped together. There's literally no parsing out of the data to see if our programs are serving everyone effectively, or if different populations that we're serving are seeing the same results, the same access to services. So really, everything that's going on now just really shines a spotlight on why you know, what we're hoping to do and what we're trying to do is important in and of itself, but especially given the lack of equity that we're seeing. The other big thing, to go back to something Chekemma said, I think we really need to take a good hard look at how we're providing monitoring / technical assistance with all of our programs. I think from a state perspective, and I'm sure it's a little bit of the same thing when the federal government evaluates us, it's very much compliance driven. And I think there's a real opportunity to provide better technical assistance and better support, especially to some of our smaller programs or newer programs, to help them collect, have the infrastructure and the structures in place to collect the kind of information that allows them to tell the positive story that they're doing, or why what they're doing and the types of interventions they're taking are having a positive impact on the customers we serve, and also provide us with the evidence of things that are happening or that we're doing aren't accomplishing those goals, what we can do to improve those things.
Thanks, James. I guess going, kind of flowing from that, first I want to just acknowledge how significant this is, that you all were able to achieve this. I know in this moment there's a lot of significant action happening in the country, around COVID and around racial justice. And so it's hard to kind of shine a light on this particular change, in the way that government does things, but it is very significant. I want folks to know that for the state board to adopt these unanimously and to agree that, you're taking that next step forward in this journey, is really significant. We don't see this happening in very many other workforce boards at a state level. And so just really want to congratulate and commend you all for doing this and for kind of what you've signed up for too, right? Of like continuing this journey. It's going to be a lot of work, but obviously, I'm sure that we'll keep going together. So I'm excited about that. But James, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about why, in your opinion, why the Pennsylvania Workforce Board decided to adopt these evidence definitions, and how do you imagine leveraging them as you go forward?
Thanks so much, Celeste. And I think the biggest reason, I kind of touched on already, is that, there's an awful lot of money. I would argue that we could use more, always, but that flows into workforce programming. And, we didn't necessarily have the ability to tell the story of what's happening or properly evaluate. So, and like you said, this is a first step in that process. But it was, there were some challenging conversations, and there's a lot of fear too. So I think, Chekemma and our other committee chair that we reviewed this did a really nice job in shepherding people along the way. I think there's a big apprehension. Anytime someone says we'd like to evaluate your program, they immediately alarm bells start going off that we want to take a look at what you're doing and take things away because you're not doing it well. So getting to a place where everybody agreed that this was our foundation and our agreed upon language, I think was a really good first step, but it definitely is a first step. And the next thing we're going to do is put out a survey to all of our programs, and ask them where they think they are on this continuum of evidence for the purposes of evaluation. And I suspect we're going to get answers all over the board. But I think we can use that information to build out that technical assistance to help programs get to where, I think everybody wants to get to that place where they can speak about the work that they're doing and be able to show how it's positively impacting the customers that we serve. So the one additional piece I'll add to that too, I think prior to being involved with the workforce system, my assumption was always that every person comes to us voluntarily for services, and that's not the case, right? Whether it's through programs like RICIA or other things, folks are mandated to come in and get services from these from whether it's from the state or these programs. And if we're not confidently able to tell them that, yes, this will have a positive impact on you, we're doing a pretty big disservice to some people that are already dealing with some pretty difficult situations. So.
Thanks, James. Yeah, those are really important pieces to think about, just having more information. But yeah, then also, you know, at a minimum, like, do no harm, right? Yeah. Chekemma, I know you wanted to add something here too.
I think James covered it well. The only thing that I would add is, you know, as a facilitator of the dialogue and sort of a supporter of the information, one of the things that was very clear in our discussions was the need to have a baseline understanding of just what the framework was about, which was about categorizing types of evidence, not valuing one type of evidence over another type of evidence. And I think that was, so this, it became abundantly clear to me from introducing the framework and having the first set of discussions to the second set of side discussions. So there was at least like 3 rounds of discussions, 2 publicly in the committee, but then all of the in-between work, because people were actually really engaged and invested, but also committed to their perception and understanding. And so on a committee of folks, you know, designed to give guidance and governance to the work and support the goals that are outlined by our governor, the lack of calibration that we had in that conversation was a big driving force for me to get us to a place of some commonality, because it said to me, like, these are folks who have been appointed, selected, however you got around the table, you are here now and you represent a cross section of what's happening here in the Commonwealth. Well, if we are not really clear, then imagine the diversity that will happen on the local workforce board level, right? And if we allow all of it to be open for interpretation, how are we going to make systemic level change and systemic level progress, right? I get how you make community level progress or even individual level progress, but we're trying to, you know, make a larger level impact. And so it just became really clear to me in our discussions why the need for a common set of like clear framework was critically important, and also why an outside entity that's respected and had already done the work was also valuable, right? So it wasn't Chekemma's version of evaluation that I was putting forward, asking for endorsement, you know, coming from representing the Philadelphia area with my experience. It was actually looking at a different level of expertise, if you will, coming in and saying, like, this is the work that we've done here, you can maximize that, because we all had very different perspectives about it, and facilitating that conversation was one of the, it became really clear to me that that was important in the process in order to get this step going. Like, we couldn't make progress beyond this if we could not land on agreement.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, you know, thanks so much to you, Chekemma, for your leadership, because, yeah, some of those conversations were challenging. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I'm curious, so, and, you know, another thing that, of course, is on everyone's minds and has the workforce system in particular, you know, head spinning, just because there's such a great need. But I'm wondering, Allison, if you can share a little bit from the Commonwealth's perspective of how you see this effort linked to the Commonwealth's ability to respond to the evolving COVID crisis.
Sure, thanks, Celeste. So COVID obviously is challenging all of us as individuals and as a society, but especially in state government, to rethink how we deliver government services, and in our case, workforce development services. Not unlike other states, our Commonwealth revenues are down, and we've seen a very significant increase in demand for workforce development services. So we have to reevaluate how basically our investments and our strategies in workforce development so that they are relevant in light of COVID, and that they are targeted to reach the customers, both individuals and businesses that have been impacted by this pandemic. And obviously, we have to think about our customers that we're reaching out and we were engaging before the pandemic started. We have had a significant influx of people since the pandemic started that have been directly impacted. So our universe of customers has really increased a lot in the last 3 months. And just for context setting, in Pennsylvania, we have had over 2 million UC claims. That's both federal and state claims. So for the inclusive of the new federal unemployment compensation programs. And our unemployment rate was just under the federal rate of 15.1. So we were nearly 15% unemployed. Although I think new federal rates just came out. But in any case, right now we're just under 15%. So with such limited resources and with this increase in demand, we have an opportunity to use this framework to help us make investment decisions in programs and strategies that are demonstrating effectiveness, so that we know that our investments will have an impact on those that we're trying to serve and reach our overall goals. And for us, in light of COVID, that's, kind of rapid reemployment, but also kind of our longer term goals related to helping connect, helping businesses create family sustaining jobs that pay family sustaining wages, and then hopefully connecting Pennsylvanians with them. Obviously, we've already talked about equity being a priority, but also trying to connect people with long-term career pathways and career advancement over the course of their lives. And so as we change our approach in light of COVID, we'll be investing in new strategies, we'll be reevaluating what we've already done. And by using evidence to help us determine what works and doesn't work, it helps us support a cycle of continuous improvement within the system. And I think what the State Workforce Board has done is sent a signal that this is a priority to all of our workforce partners. And I think there's a real opportunity to both look at what we've already done, but also still support innovation. I think that, COVID is making us think creatively about what we do. And I don't think that there is a lot of evidence in some of the strategies that are either already out there or that are coming. But I think, like I said, sending a signal that, evidence is important and you can use evidence on top of new strategies, I think we're able to kind of find a good balance there.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I definitely don't think there's a roadmap for where we need to go, but I think it's great to have a goalpost, right? We know that we want to, go on this evidence journey and to use what we do know that has worked in the past with innovation. That's a really great point. So I want to turn back to Chekemma because as we kind of alluded to, there were a lot of discussions as these evidence definitions were being considered and debated, and folks reached out from the committee individually to me as well. We had some side conversations just because, I think there's a lot to consider when adopting these definitions. Maybe the actual definitions themselves were not challenging in and of themselves, but the idea of, well, where do we go and how do we make sure that everyone's kind of with us on this journey? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, just some of the challenges and how we were able to facilitate that discussion.
Sure. So I think one of the assets that we had, before I even start with the challenges, was that people were very engaged. It's so engaged and empowered. They reached out to you with or without invitation. They reached directly out to me. They talked to James. And I think that was an asset in a lot of ways because it helped us to understand where those sticking points were and also refine, I think, the way that we were presenting information to the group. So one of the bigger challenges is that the group is just diverse, right? It is not homogenous, and what I mean by that is we have people all the way from like government offices to local practitioners to technology, folks from technology, schools, career and technical education, and with any experts in a discipline, they have a language that they're used to communicating in, and that language has meaning. And oftentimes, you know, as a leader, I'm always saying we should check for meaning, because I know I use that word and I speak English and you speak English and we both said the same word. But because I'm a social worker by trade and I work in youth development, when I say what's best for young people, I mean some very specific things. That does not necessarily mean that you also mean those very specific things. And where we get tripped up is that because we use the same words, we assume that there's meaning and understanding behind that. And that's a challenge. And you have to recognize that. I think that's a challenge because it takes a unique set of skills to translate across, you know, to be a translator, but also to be sophisticated enough in a virtual meeting format or a phone call format to hear that we are actually saying the same thing, but we mean very different things, and therefore more discussion is needed. So that was like one big challenge. Some of the other challenges around applying a continuum of definitions around evidence that came up, I found it very comforting. I'm going to do full disclosure to those listening. I found it very comforting that there was a scale of evidence and that that there was a space for many types of programs. What was interesting was that it didn't seem to bring as much comfort to my colleagues on the committee that it did to me. It actually rose up a lot of questions. And so while each definition was clear, the lack of understanding about how could you apply this when you think about programs that are in a very different space, because each person brought their unique lens to it. And I think understanding that there were development areas. I think everybody around the table was really clear, like our programs may or may not be ready for this. What investments are we willing to make for training? What investments are we willing to make for program development and learning? And then I think the other piece that was a huge part of concern for our group was around the stringent focus. Like, would evaluation hamper innovation? And when programs are in a space, especially in the time of COVID-19, and we were having some of these conversations post some of the changes we've made as a result of COVID, needing to maintain innovation within the system and encourage that, there were concerns that this kind of approach to categorizing every program would squelch that. And I think the other piece is, how do we create a culture of continuous improvement and learning when currently WIOA funded programs really do have much more of a reporting mindset, right? Like, I'm telling you, it's an output outcome counting kind of thing, and I give that information to you regularly. But this requires, in order for the evaluation matrix to be successful, it requires us to be both like really clear about why our program landed in a space, but also reflective about the journey of growth, and then invest time and energy into growing. And I think folks were saying, like, that's not the system we have, right? I think they were being really honest about that. And so how is doing this step going to actually affect this problem? And the way we managed that was really to say, this is the first step, not the only step. And I think that was helpful. Like, a step is we all have to get in the same book. And I think this step allows us to get in the same book. Now, there are other steps that will allow us to get in the same chapter and then on the same page, but this was really important. The first step was the one that was going to allow the other steps to be possible.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, because I think it's helpful to see kind of behind the scenes a little bit about how this happens. And yeah, just the human aspect of it and the system aspect of it, all really important. So thank you for sharing that. I want to, before I open it up to the rest of the panel, I want to do one thing, which is to let the audience know that we're going to move into some question and answer time so that you all can pose your questions to the panel. So if you want to go ahead and do that through the chat function, then Quinn and Lainey, who are from RFA, are going to help moderate those questions and make sure that we can answer as many as possible. So please go ahead and start doing that, entering your questions into the chat. And while folks are doing that, I wanted to see, if James or Allison want to reflect on any of the challenges. I don't know if either of you want to share any insights that you gained around the challenges that we face.
Well, I might just add, and Chekemma touched on this, that you know, sometimes our natural instincts are to associate change with fear. And I think in this case, change is, you know, really, this is a positive change that we're embarking on for our workforce development system and initiatives. James had mentioned that one of our most immediate next steps is to survey our workforce partners to get a better understanding of what the baseline is in both understanding of these new evidence definitions, but also their capacity to do program evaluation and apply these evidence definitions to their work. We have a lot of other, you know, next steps as it relates to this project. You know, we are doing that work as a Commonwealth, trying to figure out what our strengths and opportunities are as it relates to program evaluation. And we'll be using a lot of the information that we get from that survey to figure out how we can provide more technical assistance and training to the field in addition to building our own expertise. I think that will be a challenge. This is basically an overlay of really changing how we do business in workforce development. So I see this as a combination of practical changes we can make, but also a cultural one. And cultural change is, I would say, more difficult. So, anyway, I think there's a lot of work to do. I don't necessarily think it's going to be easy, but I'm really excited about it because, you know, we've wanted to go in this direction for a long time, but RFA has helped provide us with the tools and framework to really take these ideas and implement them in practice, even if we're at the very, very beginning of this work.
Thanks. James, anything you wanted to add?
You know, I think just to emphasize the point that Allison made around culture change, I think, you know, we talked a lot today about, you know, the changes that need to be made on the way that our programs conduct business, but really the way that the state's gonna have to support and provide the foundation to help the programs get there is a big shift from the way that we've done things traditionally. You know, even as something as fundamental as the way we put out solicitations for grant awards, you know, asking the questions in a way that helps programs start thinking about what they're going to need to collect from the participants and you know, the customers of our workforce system in order to be able to do the evaluations down the road. I think traditionally we have a good idea, we send some money out, and then when it's done, we say, okay, let's see what we did. And if you don't take those steps in the beginning of the process, it makes it much harder to properly evaluate something than if you had taken those, laid that infrastructure in the beginning of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess our last question, which it sounds like was echoed by one of our audience members, but I'd love to hear from each of you. What advice would you give to other state workforce boards, agencies that are considering taking the same step of defining evidence for their workforce system and then leveraging that going forward?
For me, I'm happy to jump in. I think there are some important pre-steps before you could even get to like looking at different frameworks around evidence. And one of them is taking the time to define your motivations and intentions for improvement. I think it helps a lot with what Allison shared, which is like the fear that comes with having some of these conversations. If you're really clear about what you're trying to accomplish and you've kind of assessed and come up with language to articulate to those who are making decisions or grappling with this, why it is important, that's, I think, a really important first step before you even get to looking at specific spaces of evidence. And then I think the other piece is around ownership and accountability. So recognizing that this is not a change process that's happening outward, right? There's one stance that you can take. It's like, this is our new definition of evidence. You figure it out, programs, but this is what we expect of you. And then there's another space that, you know, James articulated with, this is about all of us growing, right? And so like the Commonwealth, the way that we think about success or the way that we solicit partnerships in terms for money, but all of it has to adjust now to some goals that we all share. And I think that that is something that, you know, making it explicit that change is happening in multiple domains, not just something that's happening to the system of services, is really, I think, important for the way in which we embrace the transition. And I think the other thing is being mindful that place, like resources and other policies, affect your ability to meet these standards or evidence of effectiveness, right? And so it's not just a conversation about definitions. If you have practices that sort of hamper a program's ability to move forward, or you as a entity hasn't taken on any evaluation activities and made that a part of your learning agenda, like we have to lead by example. And I think that that is the other place of advice that I would offer.
I don't know if this is advice, but one, I would just say benefit of taking this step through a state workforce board is that it created a natural mechanism to engage our stakeholders. And I think we did that in a couple ways. Obviously, Chekemma workshopped this with her youth committee. We also did it with our continuous improvement committee. We had local partners as part of our fellowship, and that is kind of where we started talking about this. And it created a public forum for our workforce development partners to weigh in on this. And I think, you know, when we're setting policy, I think that the more successful ones tend to have more significant stakeholder engagement. We were pretty clear that this was the direction we wanted to go. So the question wasn't, should we do this? It was, help us do this. And I think that process was really important for us in Pennsylvania. So I just wanted to add that.
Thanks so much, Allison. How about you, James? Do you have any advice to share?
You know, I think the just generally speaking on, you know, working anything through a board, especially, I mean, our board's almost 50 individuals. When you add in, you know, all the folks that participate in the committees, I mean, we're talking a couple hundred folks. It's number one, be willing to have conversations, because like Chekemma brought up, a lot of the folks that ultimately, you know, took the votes to move this forward had reservations, and not all those aren't going to come out in a large group meeting, you know. And I think Celeste got those calls too. You know, the other piece of it, I would say, is make sure that you know what the intent of what you're trying to accomplish here. Because I think a lot of people, the first thought that went through their mind was every program is going to need to be perfect on evidence, or they're going to lose out. And once we move the conversation to, this is a way that we can help all of our programs be the best that they can be, I think the conversation fundamentally switched. It was like, we're doing this to make sure that the people we serve and the programs we operate are doing the absolute best that they can. And like I said, I think that made a big difference into how those conversations went.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I think sometimes centering relationships, right, and allowing that to drive the way that you have conversations, and making sure that, yeah, people can ask their questions in the setting or in the way that they feel comfortable, and takes a little bit more work, but I think it's worth it ultimately. So we have a couple of questions that came in. I think we touched on this a little bit, but if folks can maybe dig one layer down, but how will the board and agency help homegrown service providers, local service providers, grow their evidence base so that they could actually meet these tiers if they are not meeting them yet? So kind of what kind of support, technical assistance, funding for evaluation?
I think the honest answer is we're not quite sure yet, but we're definitely kicking around all ideas that hit all of the above. I think that you know, we are trying to figure out what, I mean, I think putting money out into the field to help support evaluation is definitely on the list of things we're going to consider. We're also trying to figure out whether or not we as a Commonwealth need to, you know, as we build our expertise, create a system of TA to help all of our local workforce development boards, but also grantees. I'm, you know, if I'm being honest, one of my concerns is that, you know, we're going to create this expectation, but that small providers, community-based organizations may not already have this capacity. And so I think, you know, we're just trying to figure out, is it best that we, you know, put some money out to the field, or, you know, is it maybe is it better for us as a Commonwealth to build that capacity that we can then lend out to all of our partners, whether it's at the state level or maybe even some sort of regional consortium type thing. So I think the answer is we're not totally sure yet, but we're definitely exploring a variety of ways. And I think we'll be engaging our partners to learn from them, you know, what they think might be a good approach from their perspective. James, do you have anything to add to that?
You know, I think you hit that one pretty good. You know, just to reiterate, I think it's gonna, I think there's gonna have to be several strategies that we take. You know, and that some of our bigger programs are going to have different needs than some of our smaller programs. And I really like the concept of building out state capacity to assist with that. WIOA does provide, you know, allowable costs around third-party evaluation to bring in folks to help us with those processes. So, and you know, I think another big piece we can add on there too is providing a forum for a community of practice for the programs to come together and talk about, you know, what's working for them in their local area or for their specific programs, so that we're not losing out on sharing of those best practices.
Great, thanks. Well, I know we're closing in on time. I'm gonna get one more slide just to kind of end on a you know, expansive kind of note, but looking across different state and federal programs that define evidence and prioritize evidence of effectiveness. And, you know, I'll say within the RFA fellowship, almost all of our teams are considering actions like this. So that's very exciting to me. If you're part of a state workforce board or a local workforce board that already does this and we don't know about you, please let us know. We'd love to highlight your work as well. But just wanted to highlight that there are places to look for similar types of evidence definitions and prioritization of evidence. And then I think as we close out, we had one final question of what does success look like in 1 to 3 years? And I think we've touched on that a little bit, but maybe could each of you give just one sentence about how you envision that success?
Chekemma, you go first if you want.
No. Go ahead, James.
I think, you know, the easiest way to sum up what success looks, you know, whether it's a year or 3 years from now, that when someone says, what did you accomplish with these dollars for this program, we're going to be able to give them, you know, data and facts and a strong answer about what we did.
Yeah, for me, I think success in 1 to 3 years is that our path is clearer, and that I would be able to say, this is where we were, this is where we are, and this is where we're going in really concrete terms, and be able to articulate what we've learned, but also where we plan to grow and what investments we're making to get there.
And I just say that, you know, my hope is that a few years from now, this won't just be the only step we've taken, that we're going to connect the dots to incorporate this into, you know, all of our work, and there's a lot of steps to do that. But I see this as hopefully a part of a broader systems change around how we make investment decisions. And you know, ultimately we're in this work because we want to provide a good service to Pennsylvanians. And I hope that, you know, that this will ultimately result in better outcomes for our customers.
Wonderful. Well, I want to just thank you all again for joining us here today, but also for your work all the time, you know, every day helping to, you know, provide the services that folks need, and to think really hard about where we need to strengthen those services, how we do it, how we make sure that everyone is, you know, carried along with that journey. And I look forward to working with all of you. For all the audience out there, thanks for joining us. And please, you know, feel free to connect if you want more details on any of this, if you want to hear about our other workforce projects, and we'll be sharing the slides and the recording after this webinar is done. So thank you so much. Please imagine that everyone is roaring and clapping for you, even though you can't hear them, and take care. Thanks.
Thanks, Celeste. Have a great day.
Thank you.